Okay, so I wanted to mention something before we move on. The goal for the Gauss-Jordan method is to get to a matrix like this. It's to get to a matrix like 1 0 0 0 1 0 1 0 0, and then whatever you have in here. These are gonna be numbers. Okay, so you had it right. It is to make ones on the diagonal, but you also, the goal is also to make zeros before below each one and above each one. So I need to have 0 here, 0 here, 0 above the one, 0 above below, and then 0 above this one. So you notice now that from what we just did, we just got these two zeros right here. So now my next goal is to have a 1 in this position, but I have a -5 in this position, and then a 0 in here, right? But you notice I have a -5 and a -2, but notice that the row below has a -5 and then a 0. So another legitimate operation I can do is interchange row 2 with row 3. Okay, so when I do that, I'll have the first row stays the same, and then instead of row 2, I'm going to have row 3, 0, -5, 0, and then -10, and then instead of row 3, I'll have row 2. So just like when you have an equation, you can subtract from both sides, or you can multiply both sides by something. These are legitimate things that we can do with the system, because if you think about it, the system could have been given like, you know, it doesn't matter if I say this is the first equation and this is the second and this is the third. I could say that this is the first and then this is the second and this is the third. It doesn't matter, right? That's why we can interchange this row 2 and row 3. Okay, because why did we do that? Notice that now I have a 0, well, I have the two zeros that I created, but I also have a 0 in this position. So I wanted 0 in this position. Look right here in this green matrix. I have a 0 in this position. So the only thing that I need to do is to make this -5 I need to make it a 1, right? Because that will give me 1 on the diagonal, 1, 1. Okay, so how do I do this? Well, I divide by -5. So row 2 divided by -5 becomes my new row 2. So I'm dividing by -5 row 2. So row 1 stays the same, and then row 3 stays the same because I didn't do anything to row 3. So the only thing that changes, row 2 got divided by -5. 0 divided by -5 is 0. -5 divided by -5 is 1, because that's what I wanted. I wanted this to be a 1. And then 0 divided by -5 is a 0. And then -10 divided by -5 is a 2. Okay, so that's my goal. I accomplished this goal. I made this a 1 and this stayed a 0. Okay, so I have these. So what do I have to do next? Well, next, what do I have left? I need to make this a 1, this needs to become a 0, this needs to become a 0, and this needs to become a 0. So that's what we're going to work on next. Alright, so let's make this -5 a 0. So how am I going to do that? I'm going to use row 2. So I need this to be a 5 so that when I add it, I'll have 5 minus 5. So I'm going to take 5 times row 2 and add it to row 3. And that's going to become my new row 3. Okay, so everything else stays the same. So row 1 and row 2 stay the same. But now instead of row 3, I'm going to put 5 times row 2 plus row 3. So it's going to be 5 times row 2. So it's going to be 5 times 0 is 0 plus row 3, which is also 0. So I still better have a 0 in here. And then 5 times 1 is 5. And then So it's 5 in here. 5 times 1 is 5, and then plus -5 is 0. So my -5 became a 0. And then I have 5 times 0 is 0, minus 2. So I have a minus 2 in here. And then 5 times 2, right, I'm going 5 times row 2, so it's 5 times 2 is 10, minus 16, minus 6. Okay, so we made this -5 became a 0. That's all good. I have more zeros now, so the only thing I have left now is to make this a 1, and then this a 0, and this a 0. So to make -2 a 1, we simply just divide row 3 by -2, and that's my new row 3. So row 1 stays the same, row 2 stays the same, but row 3 becomes divided by -2. So I'll get 0, 0, and then 1, and then -6 divided by -2 gives me a 3. Good, I'm getting closer, because now the only thing I have to change is to make this a 0 and this a 0, and then I'm done. So how do I make this 3 a 0? Well, I am going to make I need to make this one a -3, for example. So I can do -3 times row 2 plus row 1. That's my row 1, because I'm changing row 1 now. So I'm changing row 1 this position. So -3 times row 2. So it's -3 times 0 plus row 1. So it's still going to give me a 1. Now -3 times row 2. So -3 times 1 is -3, and then plus the 3, that's a 0. That's what I wanted. And then -3 times 0 plus row 1 is a 1. -3 times row 2 is -3 times 2 now, which is -6 plus 10. That's a 4. Okay, and everything else stays the same. 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 0, 1, 3. Alright, so the last step, the only thing we need to do now is make this one a 0. How are we going to do that? Well, I can just so I'm still changing row 1, right? I'm changing row 1. So I can just subtract row 3. Row 3, or row 1 minus row 3 goes into row 1. So instead of row 1, oh, why is this disappearing? Row 1 minus row 3 goes into row 1. So row 1, 1 minus 0, no, 1 minus 0 in here is 1. 0 minus 0 is 0. 1 minus 1 is 0. And then 4 minus 3 is 1. And then row 2 stays the same. 0, 0, 1. And row 3 stays the same. So you see, we have reached our goal. We have zeros all above and below the diagonal, and 1 on the diagonal. So basically, this gives me the answer to the solution, because this one is for x, this one is for y, and this one is for z. So this tells you that x has to be equal 1. This tells you that y equals 2. And this tells you that z equals 3. So this is the solution to the system. So we're done. So basically, this is really easy to miss something. You miss a sign, you copy the wrong thing. All you have to do is really understand that your goal is to bring it into this form, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1. Okay, and then whatever numbers. Here it doesn't matter, they can be anything. So your goal is to make 1s on the diagonals and 0s below and above. So you can play with it and you practice, and you should get it. I hope this helps.